I'm going to be doing a demo talk. All of the code I'm going to be showing is already written and published in this repository. The different branches are the kind of like the different stages of the workshop. So if you ever want to go back and look at the workshop, that's what I'm going to be showing today. Yeah, okay. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is some changes that are coming in migrations. I've been working on migrations a fair bit recently. It currently uses Finks under the hood, and while Finks has served us really well, we've run into a couple like compatibility issues and kind of challenges in maintaining both of these projects. When we want to add new features to Cake, we have to add them to Finks, and then it doesn't always make sense. So what I've done is kind of like extracted a lot of the Finks logic and put it into migrations and kind of made it an opt-in flow. So if you are using migrations in your project, I'd really appreciate if you could kind of update the configuration to have this like migrations backend. And what this will do is switch to the new backend for migrations, to the one that's built into the migrations plugin. And if your migrations don't run, let me know, or open a GitHub issue and we'll get it fixed. Migrations should work without any changes. There are a couple small breaking changes around how you work with queries inside of migrations. So if you're doing like database queries where you're building querying for state or like inserting new records and not using the ORM helpers, then those things might not work depending on what you're doing. It's impossible to cover all the scenarios. But if there are scenarios that we could fix and could address, I'd like to get that fixed. As for like what changes with migrations, nothing. You should just, your migrations that you have written should continue to run for the time being. If you've imported any of the Finks kind of interfaces or type classes or anything like that, I'm interested in hearing your use cases because some of them have been ported and some of them haven't. So if you're referencing a lot of Finks code in your migrations, please open an issue because that's, yeah, I can't read your migrations because they're in your code and I can't see them. And instead of everything breaking in a couple of months when we switch the backend out, it'd be good to get that fixed ahead of time. So yeah, that's my like PSA about migrations, stuff that's coming up, and changes that will happen in the future. So once you like set that config flag, what will happen is, you know, if you're running migrations, I think it'll tell you. Can't even type today. Brain's not working. It will tell you which backend it's using, and then that's another way you can check to see whether you're using Finks or whether you've switched over to the new backend. As for like commands, they all kind of work the same as they used to. I'm gonna keep typing it wrong every time. So yeah, migrations run, dumping works, seeds work, all of that kind of stuff should just work out of the box. As for this workshop, I'm using migrations. So we'll just rebuild the whole database from scratch and we'll talk about what the database is, what's in the database. And I've also, something I like to do is building a seeder to like bootstrap an application so you have some local testing data to work with. I find this is a really helpful pattern for me. I'd use it a lot in my like professional work. So we'll show that as well. But seeds are a good way to kind of get your application kind of started. Okay, so talked about migrations. I wanted to, the kind of foundation of this, the rest of the workshop is built on top of this idea of like having a multi-tenant application or kind of structure or like data model that you can use across multiple applications. I've built a bunch of like multi-tenant applications and they all kind of have the same shape again and again and again. So I wanted to kind of share that model that I've used many times. And hopefully it helps you in the work you're doing if you ever have to build you know, a system that has multiple tenants with like multiple groups of members. So we can kind of look at the data model first, and then we'll go into how that's all implemented. So I put together this diagram. This is very hard to read on the side, but it's kind of like an entity relationship diagram. If you haven't used a ton of UML, that's okay. We're going to do a crash course in UML as well. So these are the kind of like your models. You can kind of model out each of the properties in each of these, and then these kind of crow's feet links. Can I zoom it? I don't know. Let's find out. Nope. it just gets smaller. Okay, we'll zoom out, I guess. I don't know. Can we pinch it? Oh, we can do that. There we go. Didn't know we could do that. Okay, so these crow's feet, like here. That's a 1 on one side, and if you're on the other side, This is a many over here. Oh boy, we don't want to do that. And so this is kind of an optional many. It's kind of the idea in UML. And then you have down here, you have whoa. This is like a not optional many, right? So that we can kind of model, we can kind of do our drawing. So we can say like, one organization has many invites, or like one organization has many projects. Projects have many teams. One organization has many teams, like a team can't belong to multiple organizations. Users kind of exist outside of the scope of organizations, or some places they call them workspaces or applications, or like organizations. It's kind of like or an account. Sometimes it gets called in some application models. And then, users belong to many organizations through memberships with a specific role. Because where we're going to kind of go with this workshop is kind of building a role-based application and then building permissions with access controls below the organization role. So in addition to an organization role, we're also going to do some like team membership permissions. So you can say like, a user who is on a team and that team is assigned to this project can modify the project, but members who are part of other teams can't modify those projects. And projects it's kind of like a placeholder. It could be any type of subunit of an organization. So the kind of the frame of reference I've had is like within an organization, there's many like areas of responsibility or collections of work that different groups of people work on. You need to be able to do access controls, like, legal team doesn't need access to the documents that the engineering team works on, or engineering can't have access to legal's, workspace or information that's stored in there. So it gives you a way to like subdivide resources inside of an application or inside of an organization based on like what teams or roles people have. So it's a fairly like flexible way to kind of model applications, I find. Is this kind of resonating with anyone? Any applications that you folks have built? Yes, no, maybe so, maybe not. All right, we'll go back to the terminal now. Okay, so how that manifests in schema. We start off with building a couple tables, and my cursor's on that screen. Okay, so one thing I've found many applications need is a way to set runtime options, and we'll use this later in the application. So you have options that can sort in the database whether things are visible or not visible. It's kind of just like a key value store is kind of how this works out. It's like a key value, a key and a value, and then things have types. So you can store integers or floats, and then when you read it out of the database, we could cast it in the future. That hasn't been built as part of the workshop, but it could be built. Next, we need a way to invite members. I like to keep invitations separate from memberships because invitations are not members. And you convert a member, like you convert an invite into a member. So again, invites are scoped by organization. They require an email and then a role that when that person clicks through that invite, they get that role granted to them. And you could have team assignments baked into that as well. And then once an invite's been claimed, we can set which member claimed that invite. And then next there's memberships. So again, they're organization scoped. It's kind of a link between an organization and a user. So it's a way of like inviting people into a workspace or inviting people into a company. They all have roles. This kind of feeds into the permissioning system. Each user can only be part of one organization once. Like you couldn't invite the same person 4 times with 4 different roles. That's confusing and makes no sense in most scenarios that I've worked on. A lot of times you need some sort of flexible key value store for organizations, some sort of config options. You could either make like a really wide table with Boolean columns for everything, or you could just go and just give up and just do a key value store. It really depends on the read and write access patterns of the application. I find the key value store is really useful because you just generally want to read 1 or 2 keys at a time, and then you can build caching on top of that, and you can build nice kind of application interfaces on top of these things. For the purposes of this workshop, I kept organizations really simple, just like a slug and a name. I like having slugs because they are a little bit more friendly for humans to work with. They're not great for computers. Slugs have the drawback of like if you rename something, then the slug changes, and then all the links that were referring to the slug are now broken. So if you're building like a public-facing API, slugs aren't so great. But if you're building like a web browser interface, slugs are very helpful. So we need both IDs and slugs. And then projects is just kind of a container for other things. This is like your subdivision of work or resources inside an organization or a company. And then there's the link tables between like projects and teams. Teams have many members, so there's another link table or join table or junction table, whatever you want to call them. Teams, again, have a slug for using in URLs or for humans to talk about them. And then also a name. There's other things you could add to teams. You could have options. You could have configuration on a per team level. That's all kind of up to you. Users can have multiple emails. Many people have multiple email addresses. This allows you giveaways to kind of have verified emails, all of that. I didn't build that out for the workshop, but it is kind of modeled. And then users, they have email addresses. I like to just use the email address as the username. Having a username separate from an email address gets really confusing for non-technical users. They struggle with the concept of a username not being their email address. They just remember their email address. So I find in newer systems I've been building, I don't have a username column that is distinct from an email column. I just use the email address as the username, because it's just a lot more straightforward for less technical users. And then a password containing the hash, and then whatever attributes you want to have for your user. I put a name and last active timestamp, which we could update as we do logins. It's important to make your username or email field a unique field. Otherwise, terrible things will happen if you have 3 people with the same email address or 3 people with the same username. So just make it unique. And then there's some foreign keys, and that's kind of it. And then the down migration is just a bunch of drop operations. So we don't need to look at that. Okay, and I mentioned using a seed. So I like this approach as a way to generate some sample data. Sometimes it's hard if you're working on a project and you don't know what the data is supposed to look like, or you don't have representative sample data, or you're trying to figure out what the data should look like in order for this application to be useful. And this is a great way, this is a perfect place for seeders to fit into your workflow. So you can generate a user of every role with a known email address. You can just memorize the email addresses so that your day-to-day workflow is kind of easy. You can test what the application looks like as each user role. I like to set all the passwords to be the same because then I only have to remember one password. This also allows you to bypass a lot of the validation that your application might have as well. If you wanted all the passwords to be password for local development, terrible idea in production, a terrible idea in staging environments and all of that, or any production or production adjacent environment. But for local development, the same password for everyone makes it really easy to work with and makes it really easy to kind of understand, versus having to remember the distinct 32-character password for that specific test user. Some people are give me shady eyes. It's okay, I agree. So we'll make some users, we'll make an organization. Coming up with names for things is challenging. You can either, if you have some set names you want to use, you can do that. Another great library to use is Faker. Faker will just generate random string values and generate random text and random numbers and all of that. So I find that's really helpful for just generating some sample data. You can put length constraints on things. So Faker's good like that. And then we can just generate a little bit of sample data that doesn't change automatically. You can use loops. Everything you would want to do in your application, you can just build with fakers or with seeds. And you can link seeds together if you need to, or have multiple ones for different types of local testing environments. So yeah, that's kind of what seeds do. So now we have a basic, some sample data set up. So we can run a server. And should be able to look at the application. I logged in earlier today, so we'll see if the session still works. Nah. That's okay. We're also using URLs that don't exist yet. So I was looking at okay, neat. So it directed us to the first user, which is now called Garrett Whitting, because it's random data. And we have one organization, and then we can look at some members and projects and all of that. So yeah, that's kind of where we ended up. So we'll go back to terminal, and we can look at some of the code. 1 second, just gotta get my notes. Okay, I also set up this application to have the authentication and authorization plugins because we're going to be doing a lot of that. So we can look at how that's all wired up too. So we look at the application. It's a fairly standard kind of setup for authentication. I sometimes feel bad that this is standard. I feel like this could be made a lot simpler. But yeah, if you have ideas on how we could make this simpler, I'd love to work with you on that. Yeah, so standard kind of setup, authorization, authentication plugins. If we want to look at the user's kind of setup, the login method is kind of straightforward. We skip authorization, which is a really important thing. If you don't do this, the authorization plugin will be like, you didn't do any permission checks. I'm gonna get angry at you. You also need to disable authentication requirements. So you need to kind of turn off authentication so that the login view doesn't require authentication to look at the login page, because how can you log in how can you be logged in if you're trying to look at the login page? So yeah, we kind of require that. And then logout is, again, fairly typical. And then looking at some basic policies. So if we look at a organizations controller, let's just say, I've set up authentication, or sorry, set up authorization. Oh, you see the wrong screen. All right. There we go. Sorry about that. I have that terminal there is connected to a terminal on my screen because I don't see what you see. So I can see my notes because I didn't want to show my notes. Magic of being a terminal editor. You can just link your terminals together. Okay, so all of the, every controller action has a scope applied or has a policy check. If you've worked with authorization before, this will seem really straightforward. But if you haven't worked with authorization before, the idea is you want to apply authorization checks after, kind of separately from the rest of your application logic. Like you load a record off the database and then check, is the person who's doing this request allowed to look at this record? And if we're doing like a list view, we just want to filter that down, because doing a check on every single row, if you're scanning a database, you don't want to fetch every row to the database and then check them one at a time, because you could check millions of records before you get to one that's relevant. So when we're doing like aggregate or list views, we want to do the permission checks to the query. So that's why you see apply scope versus authorize. So authorize does it for a single record, and apply scope does it for a collection, or a query that will turn into a collection. And if we're going to look at how those policies get implemented, when we do a scoped query, so this is a policy that applies to a query, we're just going to add conditions in. So if our authentication or our authorization checks can be expressed as a SQL, then we can just turn them into SQL. If they can't, it gets a lot harder. So I would recommend, if possible, always try and make your access controls something you could write as SQL, because then you can do it on a list, you can do it on an individual record, at least for the list operations. You want list operations to be done in SQL, otherwise you have to fetch a lot more data out of the database and then filter it in memory, which gets hideously expensive in big applications. Okay, and then on kind of on the record level, what I've done so far is just kind of made sure that the person who's making the request is currently a member of the organization that is being changed. That's kind of the simple. We'll evolve this as we go through the workshop. But this is kind of the simplest kind of permission checks you could have. There's this user member organization IDs, which we'll look at next, and we just make sure that the current organization is within that list. And if we were to look at a project, an individual project, they all say is org member. But again, it's the same kind of check under the hood. So we're starting off with really simple membership access, and then we'll evolve it as we go. Okay, if we want to look at the user entity, call it member IDs. What? Did I not? Okay. So how do we saw in that policy we were looking at just now, This is in the wrong window. Okay, so we're using this member or organization IDs. Where does that property come from? It gets defined as an attribute on the entity itself. And so kind of the applications the way I've done a lot of applications, you kind of have to have some state loaded on the user as well. So when we load the user during login, we load all of their memberships as well, just so that we can do access control checks without having to do more database queries. So if there aren't any memberships, then we blow up because something's gone wrong. If not, we can just map it into a list, and then we have all of the organization IDs that a user has. If users go into thousands of organizations, then there's obviously problems. We're going to be loading too much data, but that person has chosen their fate and has chosen poorly. There are some problems in programming where you just say, just don't do that, and I think that's a valid answer. Like, when I have 10,000 orgs, it doesn't work. Okay, don't do that. It'll be fine. One of the other things that I've done in this project is use some enums. I find a lot of applications have enums. They're all over the place. And an enum could be, an enum is just like any type of there's a set number of choices and you have to pick one of them, or it could be null. And so in the past, we've had to model this as a string, and then you have to have validation rules, and you have to be is it one of these valid choices, and you have to write all of that code yourself. And it's tedious and not much fun. I think it was mid Cake 4, Cake 3, 4.3 or 4.2 or something like that, maybe it was 4.4. Enum support landed in PHP, and so now we can actually define enums as code. So you can define cases with strings. I like strings. Some people make all their enums numbers. This saves on storage space in the database, but makes your life unpleasant when you have to write ad hoc queries and you have to remember what is role one? I guess it might be owner. And for columns that you use every day, number enums are okay-ish. But if you're not working every single day and you don't, or if you have a lot of enums, I find strings are just a lot easier to work with because you can actually read the queries. You can write SQL by hand and just be and type it out because you remember the concepts, not their mapping to the numbers. So using string enums is just an ergonomic thing for humans. I feel like we should design computer systems to help humans do work versus be optimally efficient, unless they really need to. If you have a table with billions of records, storing a 7-byte character, could add up, but probably is not going to matter unless you have trillions of records, and then you have lots of other problems where an enum is probably not your biggest problem. Okay, so now when we want to use that in the ORM, we have an enum, and then we can use this enum type class from Cake to generate a mapping for that enum, and so there's no real good way for the database reflection to know that this column is an enum. You could use an enum in the schema. My experience has been that this is a terrible choice. Enums in the database are very hard to change because they require you to take table locks, and once your table gets to a certain size, a table lock takes you down. So unless your application's at a state where a minute or two of downtime is acceptable when you want to just add a column or add a type to an enum, don't use enums in the database, just use string columns and do all the constraints in the application level. That's been my experience. It's just a lot easier. Enum types are a pain in the butt to evolve in any database vendor, Postgres and MySQL for sure. SQLite is easy because it's just a file, but there are very few production scenarios where you can use SQLite, even though it's a really good database. Okay, so that's kind of how we use enums. And once we've mapped this to the column, the ORM is able to do validation for you. So it'll automatically, convert request data. So if you were to send request data with, member, it would pass. But if you sent it with a value that wasn't within the enum, it won't work. And that happens kind of all over the place. And so we'll just do that in a quick little console session. I'm a big fan of using REPLs to do little demos and like test things out. I know it's not for everybody, but I like doing it. Table locator. Okay, and then we can do, like, we can make a new entity. Right, and we can just set the role to like, just set it to wrong. We'll set the user ID to 1. And the organization ID to, I don't know, 5. We'll do 1 as well. So we've already gotten our validation area, you can see right here. So the ORM was able to look at the enum and then generate validation automatically. So if you're taking data off the wire, off the network, off of a command line input, you get all that validation hooked up for free, so that the ORM will really help you make it so that you don't make mistakes or get invalid data into your application. And so, yeah. So that's on the request level. You can also kind of build, validation rules really simply. So that's all you really need to do to generate a validation rule to get useful feedback for an enum value. All right. And currently we're using kind of catch-all, we're using catch-all routes. I'll just show you what I'm talking about. So currently, I have the application set up using just some catch-all routes. But if we're building, if we're going to go down the route of building a multi-tenant application, it'd be nice if I get my mouse over here, it'd be nice if when you're looking at a team, if the org context was kind of inside the URL. Sorry, just got to run the server again.
How are enums in database saved?
Pardon?
How are enums in database saved?
Yeah, we can look at that. So because I'm doing a workshop and doing a demo, I'm using SQLite because it's a good database. So they just get stored as strings. You could put indexes on them if you're going to do like filtering or conditions on these types of string columns. I would definitely put an index on them because eventually you'll start doing table scans, and those table scans will get expensive. And so we're just using.
And if the database supports enum type,
I still wouldn't use the enum type. The reason is that changing an enum type requires a locking data description or DDL statement. So Postgres will lock a table to change a type. MySQL will take an exclusive write on an exclusive lock on the table, which means no concurrent reads and no concurrent writes. So sad times. Yeah.
and the index of this column I have to do myself.
Yeah, so the question is, for the people on stream, is like if you're doing an index on this column, you would do that when you define the table in your initial migration. You'd just put an index on the column, and then it will turn into a normal index that you can do conditions on. But again, it all depends on the database you're using. Like for specifically like organization members, all of our queries are going to have an organization ID as a condition because we always want to look within an organization. So most like MySQL and Postgres will only use one index per table read. So they will, if you have an organization ID, then it'll only use that column. So you'd have to have a composite index of like organization ID and role in order for for MySQL or Postgres to pick that index as the index to use. And the one index per table thing is an interesting constraint because it requires you to make a lot of indexes. So I work on a production system that has a few billion rows in a table, but we have like 12 indexes for all the different permutations of columns that could be used, which makes writes a little bit more expensive because every write has to update all 12 indexes. But without all those indexes, the table doesn't work. So. Okay, so going back to our URLs, if we wanted to look at all the teams, like we're seeing all the teams from a single organization, but if we had multiple organizations, it'd be nice if you could look at just the teams for one org versus the other and have a quick way to like navigate between those two organizations, right? And so there's a couple ways you could do that. You could have like an organization switcher in the application, and then that switches stuff and stores some state on the client so you remember like which organization you're looking at. You could blend all of them together, but that's generally not how like multi-tenant applications work. You look at one workspace or organization at a time. So the easiest place to put that state is in the URL. And so that's kind of the next stage of this app's evolution, I think, or at least what I'd plan to do for the workshop. There are other things you could do first, but I chose this. So if we go and revise our routes, oh, you can only see the browser again. It's okay, I had to switch branches. Okay, so if we look at the revised routes, what I've done is used a couple features of the router to make routing a little bit easier to work with. So the first is using scopes. So scopes have two benefits. One is you don't have to type the same prefix out, dozens or hundreds of times, depending on how many routes you have. The application I work on day to day has 900 routes, and there's a lot of duplication in those routes, which could be solved with scopes. It's not a Cake app, so can't use that, but so scopes help you that way. The other thing that scopes do is they optimize how the router parses incoming requests. So because parts of the routes are static, we can kind of combine, Cake can generate more efficient regexes because routing at the end of the day is like under the hood. The guts of it is just a bunch of regular expressions. And so the framework can generate better regular expressions if you give it a little bit more context, which is what scopes do. I also have a pull request open for lazily evaluating scopes, but I haven't merged it because I'm afraid of breaking everyone's applications. And so the idea is with that change would have been, this interior closure here, we don't have to run that code until we get to that point that we know we're going to need those URLs, right? Because if you have 600 or 700 URLs, we don't need them all on every request. We only need a few of them. So if we structure our routes into scopes, we could just not run this code. We could do it later, like when we know we're gonna match that route, or when we're gonna match a route that hasn't been already connected. We can just start evaluating scopes and incrementally running them. Anyways, that's a tangent. The other thing I've done with these routes is give them names, and the reason for that is the array syntax for building a reverse route it works, but it's a lot of typing, and it's not much fun to work with long term. So named routes is one way you can do it. There's another kind of newer thing that's kind of come in, and that's using path parameters. So if I remember correctly, I'm going to try and do this from memory without looking at the docs. This could go very poorly. I think it's router path. There's no tab completion. Dang it. Does this work? Oh. What? Let's see what this does. Oh man. Okay. Okay, we'll do this the hard way. Something I think everyone should be comfortable doing if they aren't already is just looking at what the framework does. So I've forgotten what the code I want to write is, so I'm just going to read the source. And so we're just going to, like your application, the internals of Cake are structured with namespaces. And the namespace you reference will take you directly to the file. And so what I'm looking for is, I think it's called path element. So we're just going to look for like, yeah, it's called path URL. Okay. So when we have a path URL, we take the string and then the parameters. So we're going to do, right? So we can do that. And so that gives you a really like straightforward way to get to a URL based on its kind of canonical name. And if we had a plugin, I don't have a ton of plugins in here, but we'll make one for debug kit. This, no, it's dot. I think it's like requests. Panels. Right, so we can get into plugins like that. You can also do namespaces with slash. Yeah, slash. And vendored plugins with slash as well. So this gives you like a kind of a canonical way to refer to routes. You can also generate URLs for with parameters. So we can do org slug here, and we can just say Acme. Right, so that gives us a really kind of expressive way to write routes. And so this path URL is exposed in a bunch of places in the framework. Inside your routing array, you do path, and then you can do organizations view. And then you can do the rest of your parameters kind of in line like that. So that's the kind of a newer feature in routing. And to take this back to what I was originally talking about, is named parameters were added before path kind of names came out. And I'm thinking that path names might be a simpler solution than having to like cook up all these org names and come up with your own convention. Because what I do a lot of time is just end up with the same kind of, like I end up with a convention that kind of closely matches the controller action prefix, which is exactly what the path parameters do as well. So I'm kind of thinking that this, this whole named parameter, or like having to explicitly name your routes, maybe should go away. And maybe we could just like simplify onto path elements, but I haven't really thought through how all the rest of that's going to work. But I don't know, if you're interested in that, maybe we can talk about it more later. Okay, so yeah, the routes have been changed, and I've taken out the fallbacks. I think that's an important thing to do in an application that you're working on long term, is make sure you delete the fallbacks, because the fallbacks will give you duplicate routes. The fallbacks will also result in URLs you don't want showing up in the application. So once you've got your routes figured out and you've got past the prototyping stage, kind of explicitly name all of your routes and define all of your routes, because it'll keep your application doing the same thing all of the time. And the other thing is that named routes and path-based routes are generally more efficient to both match and to parse. So I put together a little command that we can look at for why I think you should be using named routes. So here we are, we're generating 10,000 routes with just with an array list, and we're doing some timing, and then we're doing the same thing with a named parameter. If we do bin cake route. So there is a small difference, and you may think like, oh, 10,000 routes, that's a lot. Like, why? Who generates 10,000 URLs? You do. Maybe not all at once, maybe not all in one request, but across all of the requests your application does throughout the day, it will probably generate 10 to thousands, or maybe even hundreds of thousands of URLs. And any savings you can get for free from the framework makes your application just a little bit faster. Maybe it's not a lot faster, but in aggregate, all of those little wins add up. And then someone will add a database query and you'll lose all the performance that you spent all this time carefully optimizing your routes, and someone will add a database query that doesn't have an index and does a table scan, and all your performance is gone. But you tried. We can't always win, but we can keep trying, I think. So yeah, that's kind of my pitch on why you should use named routes and why they're better. And then if we look at the templates, I think that the templates also kind of help illustrate why named routes are a little bit easier to work with. So that's not using a named route. I did use named routes somewhere. Nope, I didn't. Okay, but if we were to rewrite these into named routes, let's do that. Right, and then we can go, where the heck are we? Over here, the server's not running. Missing route. Teams could not be found. Oh, okay. Teams. Oh. We're just looking at the wrong page. So here we've changed that to orgzad. And that URL will work everywhere. Previously it was action was add. So if we were to cut and paste that link into some other view or reuse that view in a different controller, then the link would be wrong or broken. And so a named route is nice because, or like using named routes in your templates is nice because they're portable. And if you make a typo, which no one ever does, right? Pardon? Oh, you're looking at the browser again. Yeah. It's not a perfect system. So if we were to make a typo in our route, if this was a normal kind of route, it would just say, you know, oh, I made a wrong URL, cool. And then your application is a 404 and someone tells you like, oh, you got this broken link. It'd be a lot nicer if the application just like crashed, right? So now when you run tests, or if you are, you know, looking at your application locally as you're making changes and you made a typo in your route, the application now crashes and says like, this URL doesn't exist. So I'm a big fan of making applications crash as quickly and as frequently as we can because it helps people find the problems earlier. If you don't know there's a problem, it's hard to fix it. But if the application is just straight up broken, this is way easier to fix than a 404 link that hides in the application for a couple months or a year or a couple days, and then someone says you got a broken link. Or you find it through web server logs or like your error logs. This is a lot easier to find and fix, in my opinion. Okay. All right. And now let's look at kind of improving our permissions for that that application. What did I call it? It was okay. So now we've got the application kind of working to a point where it's got decent routes, it's got some, you know, decent queries going on, we've got some permissions, but we want to kind of enforce those role permissions. So what we're going to do is, what I did do is go into each of the policies and then kind of refine how that works so we can get like role-based permissions. Because the question I've heard a bunch of times from folks is like, how do I do role-based permissions with the authorization system? And thankfully, it's pretty straightforward. What I like to do is put a lot of those role checks onto the user entity. The reason for this is all of the code is done in one place, and I don't have to use inheritance, and I don't have to use traits in my policies. They can just be really simple dumb classes that are super easy to unit test because they don't have any inheritance, they don't have any state. They're just really dumb pipes. You put code in, you put objects in, and decisions come out. So that's just a kind of a design idea that I like to follow. So now we can do really simple checks like, if you want to add a project, you have to be a member of the organization. If you want to edit a project, you have to either be the owner or be a manager on the project, or you have to be a member of you have to be a member level user, but you have to be on the team that's related to that project, right? So we can build these a lot more complex permissioning systems, and we haven't changed our controller code. If we go and look at our controller, if we look at the projects controller, there's no extra complexity being added there. You we're still just calling like project authorize. If we're, editing a project, it's still just, project authorize. All of the logic that's related to figuring out whether or not a person can modify or can delete a project or any type of resource in our application is all self-contained in the policy, which I think is a really nice benefit. It helps us get those like small controllers or small commands and lets us have a kind of a consistent policy system across the application. The other thing that policies will help with is view level conditions. A lot of times people are building HTML templates. I love server-side rendering, and when I build server-side rendering, I don't want to show links that people can't use. So we can do that. We can do those kinds of checks in our templates as well. And I think I did that in the Teams. Didn't get through the whole application, but we did get into Teams, I think. Thought I did. Yeah. So here, we can, again, do our permission checks in our templates, and it'll use the policy system, but we haven't had to write a ton of extra code. We can just do our permission checks in situ, like in the template where we need it, and conditionally generate the right HTML. Another thing that I really like to do with authentication and authorization is by default the authentication and the authorization plugins, they don't really know the shape of your user entity, and we don't really want to like put too many requirements on application developers because they're already complicated plugins to get kind of working. But I think they get a lot more powerful if you do a couple kind of small changes. And we'll look at those. Okay. So the first is telling the authorization plugin that you're going to take over the identity decorator. And so it's a word salad that comes from the plugin. And what an identity decorator is the authorization plugin wants an object that it can talk to, that it can ask some questions like, has a method called can and apply scope, which are the two kind of main hooks for the authorization system. And in order for those functions to work, those methods to work, they have to have an authorization service kind of injected. So the authorization plugin kind of makes this thing called an identity decorator, which wraps around your user object and then gives it those extra methods that are needed for doing authorization checks. But if we don't want to have a decorator, we just want our user entity to be kind of the object of record, we need to kind of overwrite the decorator, but we also need to do some like post-processing and like connecting the authentication system into our user entity. Okay, so that's why we're calling this set authorization. So if we're going to look at the user entity, user, we've had to add a couple things to our user entity. So this is so we can get away from having any decorators, and so that we can have the user object everywhere. And this also lets us do one other nice thing, which is kind of update some type hints on our policy. And we'll look at those in a second. Or we'll do those changes in a minute. So our entity is now implementing the authentication and authorization interfaces. And those get imported up here. And we've been required to build a couple more things. So now we have the users can have a reference to the authorization service. So this is like the current user who's actively doing stuff in the request. We can give them an authorization service so they can do membership checks. And then the other thing we need to do is implement a couple methods. So the first is getIdentifier, which just gets an ID, and then the can and can result. So can is a basic authorization hook method that lets you check whether the current user has access to a resource, can perform an action on a resource. It's kind of abstract. And so it returns a Boolean. There's also can result, which returns a result object, which gives you like a pass or fail, and then allows you to carry some error messages, because sometimes access control checks need to have error messages. So can result is for that. And then there's apply scope, which we saw earlier, which is how we modify queries. And then there's that set authorization method, which is part of the authorization interface. And then lastly, there's this like get original data, which is used by the framework to serialize data into the session. So as your user gets, goes between pages, they need a session. And so we kind of persist that entity when they log in into the session and then read it out of the session. There's also configuration options to reread it out of the database every time if your user records change frequently, or if you have very dynamic memberships or dynamic data in the session, you can reread the user out of the database on every request as well. And then there's those methods that we used in our policies. So we've kind of lifted that organization member check out of where it used to live and put it into the user class. And I find this is a decent pattern. So then we can do like is a role, so we can use our enums for our roles, and we can make sure that the current user has the correct role on the given organization. And then if we look at is role, it's fairly straightforward. We look at getting the person's membership in that organization. If there's no membership, we fail. And if not, we just check the membership. And the membership is loaded from that same organization members that gets loaded when we fetch a user. And so, so now our policies are nice and simple, and we have up to arbitrary complexity in our policies, and it's all self-contained in one place, which is pretty nice. As for loading the user with all that required data, we do that in our application. And when we connect our identifiers, so identifiers are kind of hooks for the authentication system to be able to look for users, whether they be by password or by token, or you have a separate table full of API tokens you want to match against those. Gives you a lot of flexibility on how you locate, you read credentials out of the request and find the users that match those credentials. And you can have multiple sets of identifiers. So you can look in a password, you can look in a token, you can look in a JWT. There's a bunch of things you could stack up together. You can also have this get authentication service do different things based on the routes. So I've heard from folks in the past who are like, oh, I want password authentication in sessions for my web views or for my HTML views, but for the API, I don't want to have cookies. I only want to accept API tokens. And so the solution there is just to use the request and look at the request, and if the route is in a certain prefix or has a certain path segment or is in a certain plugin, just return a different authentication service. You don't have to make this complex, like how do I make all of them work at once? It doesn't have to be that complicated. You can just do something really, really dumb. Not dumb, but like really simple, like if request get param, if the admin, the prefix, can't type today, admin, and then you just return something different. Just do something totally different here and return only API credentials or only accept API tokens. So that's, I feel like that's a decent solution. And then you have totally separate authentication stacks. Another one that comes up is like I have two different sources of users, one for like admin users and one for regular access users. I wouldn't recommend going down that path. I would recommend using roles, but if you're already in that situation, this is returning different authentication services is a good way to accommodate both of those if they have different login pages. Hopefully they do. Okay, so going back to finders. So we want to load the user. We want to load all of their memberships so that we can do all of our access control checks pretty easily. So users table, the finder is really, really simple. We're just loading a bunch of additional associations, and then we're just going to identify. Every time we do a request, we're going to reload the user from the database. So we're going to use the session to store the ID and like some of the user data, and then on every request, we're just going to fish that user back out of the database, so that we always have fresh data. You could obviously have a cache in the middle here if you don't want to keep going to the database. There's obviously going to be some tension here between how much data you load on every request about the user and how much of it do you actually need to use. And that's going to be a balancing act. For the application that I've gotten I've included so far. You kind of need membership to be able to figure out if the person's in the organization. And then you also need their teams to be able to do team level membership, team level permissions, or project level permissions, I mean. So if we're looking at that, is project member, right? Like our type hints don't work, but if we switch these, we can actually do this now, which is quite nice. And now all of our type hints are gonna work really nicely. And if we go back to server, go here, go to a project. Right, so we just went through this code here. So we just went through can edit and we did all of this. We can even put like a little debug in here to show that we're going through that code. That's weird. Oh, derp. Okay. We've hit a different bug. I'm not going to try and solve that right now. But I will fix that later and publish the updates to the repo. Always fun to do live demos. Right, Jorge? Okay. Kind of went over that, did all of that. Right. The last one was in Teams index. That. Right, so we're going to do this. I have to get over here. Neat. That one we'll fix. This one's an easy one to fix. Where are we? Entity user line 327. Anyone know how to fix this? No? Where are we? I should. This way. We just had to add a to array. Does it exist? Yeah, because team members was a collection. Because I loaded it off the ORM right here. So the all method returns a result set. Yeah. It's probably a little bit grunky or clunky, fishing out more records from the ORM. But it also, there's a balancing act, like load too much data at the beginning, load too much data kind of on demand. There's always a balance to be had there. Yeah, I don't think loading more data from an entity is the end of the world, in my opinion. It's still all the ORM. It kind of works. Works well enough. We could also do this. So we only have to do the array cast once versus every time. Right. That should work as well. Okay. we're both looking at the same thing. So the user can edit the team, so that's why we're getting a link. If we just flip this, we can see what the other side looks like. And we don't get the edit links. So I'm logged in as the owner, so I see all the links, but if I were to log out and log back in as a lower role user, then we'd be able to conditionally generate the HTML as needed. Okay, so that's kind of how you can integrate access controls into the application and then evolve your access controls over time. So previously we had kind of wired everything up based on just basic membership access, and then we went in and layered in project and like role based memberships as well. And we didn't have to go and change our templates. We didn't have to go and change our controller logic. We're just able to change the access control part of the application kind of independently of the rest of it, which is one of the strengths of the authorization plugin in my opinion. Yeah, any questions on anything so far, or things you want to see that I haven't shown, or problems you've had setting up authorization? Maybe we can go through. No? Okay. Look at something different then. Okay.
You may authorize, you call authorize method. How it decides which permission to check, can edit, can delete, or?
Yep, good question. So the question for folks on stream is, when you call authorize, how does it know which policy to use and what action?
Depending on the method name of app,
Yep. So if we're going to look at like the Teams controller,
can I provide my own name?
yeah. Yeah. So where does authorize get the policy from? So when we set up the application, load the file. When we set up the application, we connected a resolver. And so the resolver, there's a lot of like technical jargon in some of these plugins. And so the resolver lets you match resources, because the authorization plugin doesn't really know what you're going to use it with, just that there's going to be a thing and you're going to want to check permissions on that thing. And permissions are named actions. And so the ORM resolver can map three kinds of things. One is table objects. So if you were to throw a table into a policy class, it would be able to use conventions to figure out what the name of that policy is. And the other one, the other kind of object types it can handle are entities. So it can go from the entity to it can reflect on the class name of the entity, and then use that to figure out what the policy for that entity would be. And then same for queries. So you can pass a query in, and then it will be able to resolve the query for that as well. So that's how the plugin finds the policy for the specific entity that you've given, is through the ORM resolver. If there are other things in your application, like you're consuming a web service, and then you convert the JSON response of that web service into like an application object, and you want to do policy checks on that kind of stuff, you'd have to write your own resolver for that. If you want to see what, like, resolver sounds like a complicated thing, we can just look at what's inside of it. And they're actually generally not that complicated. So policies are expected to build one kind of method, which is get policy, I think is what's, yeah, get policy is kind of the interface method. And so something comes in, some sort of mixed thing comes in, and some sort of mixed thing comes out. What those things are is kind of up to you as the builder of the resolver. And so the ORM one, probably one of the more complicated ones, we look at like whether it's an entity or whether it's a repository or a table or a query. And then each of those kind of have their own kind of separate conventions. So we basically just like reflect on the class, we cook up where we think the policy should be, and then if that class exists, then we win. If it doesn't, we lose, and we throw an exception. And so that's kind of how you can connect the authorization system to kind of anything that exists in your application that isn't just the ORM. If you wanted to do the same kind of policy resolution for web services, or for, I don't know, what other kinds of data people have floating around in their application? Just web services and the ORM, maybe some Elasticsearch results, or I don't know, another database like ClickHouse or Cassandra. I don't, yeah, anything you could read off of the network, you can turn into like an application object, and then you can write a resolver for that, and you can write policies on top of that as well. Okay. As for the action name is just provided as a parameter. So if we're looking at the teams index, we can, if we go over here, we can look at an individual team. Here. Oh yeah, server's not running. I keep doing that. Let's just leave that server running. Okay, so if we're gonna go back to our code, if we were to change this, we're looking at teams view, and we do an authorize, it's figuring out what view is. If we were to put in like, oh no, what's gonna happen is the policy should complain that the oh no action doesn't exist. So yeah, we've explicitly given an action name. Down here, where'd it go? Yeah. Right here, we put in a custom action name. So if you have a policy method you want to use multiple times because you have like a get state or a post state or a post action, you want to have different policies defined, because there are scenarios where like you can look at the edit form, but you can't submit it. I've seen applications like that. Like you can look at the form, but you're not allowed to push the OK button on it. I don't know. Maybe your application has that, but you could build those flows with policies by just providing specific actions. So yeah, so that gives you a way to like map whatever you want into here, define a policy, and then you can kind of figure out the action based on that. But yeah, the default is all conventions all the time. Because trying to make it as easy as possible. Another thing that's recently, or hasn't shipped yet, but will ship soon, is a better integration for the authentication and authorization plugins in Bake. So if you have the authorization plugin installed, and you generate controllers in the future, it will generate all of the policy hooks by default, which is kind of nice. And if you have the authentication plugin installed, it'll generate a user's controller that works out of the box with the plugin, which is kind of nice. So we're trying to make some quality of life improvements there. And if there are other ones that you find yourself routinely having to do, you should open an issue. And issues don't always have to be bugs; they can be discussions. Yeah, I'll do my best to keep it civil and and be friendly. Okay, so the next branch I wanted to look at is feature flagging. So how many people have deploys that are scary? You've worked on a feature for a bunch of months, you're ready to deploy, you want to release it and deploy it to customers, but you're scared because every time you deploy a new feature, it breaks. And then there's an hour of swear words, or many people are swearing, and it's very tense and scary and makes you sweat in the palms. I get sweaty palms when I'm really nervous. And so how do folks have that when they're making changes and deploying them? No, Jose's never made a bad deploy in his life. I don't believe that. All right, so in my day-to-day work, this happens a lot. I work at a company called Sentry. We have around 150 employees working on the same code base, and we deploy as many times a day as we can. Sometimes it's 25 times a day, sometimes it's 6, depending on the weather and CI. And the challenge with this is we're deploying not only to one region, we're deploying to 8 regions across the world, and our deploys take like multiple hours because we have to restart 40 to 45,000 Docker containers for us to do a deploy. And so deploys, if you deploy a feature if you roll out a feature with a deployment, it's very scary because it's going to break, and then it's going to keep breaking across the thing, or you're going to have to stop deploys, and everyone's going to be like, "Why are deploys stopped? I need to deploy my change," and you're going to end up being the bad guy for that day, or bad person for that day. So how do we do deploys but make them safe? We deploy the code and we don't run it, because code that doesn't run doesn't break, right? So how do we deploy code where it's off? And the way that many teams do this, and the way that I do this, is through an idea called feature flags. So the idea is you can deploy your application, and then separately you can deploy configuration. That's kind of the first step that you need to be able to do to go down this path, is be able to deploy the code for your application and deploy the configuration for your application separately. So that could be deploying just one file, like your application config file, or just the config file for your feature flags. But you need to be able to deploy configuration separately from the application code. And then we can separate turning things on from deploying new behavior. And so the way that I've done that in this application is there's a separate config file just for feature flags. And so I've stolen some ideas from my work, because I've been working on feature flagging for about a month and a half. And so I was like, well, this would be a cool workshop topic. And so the idea is that, like, features, there's an application has many features that could be in different, stages of stability. And then we want to be able to define, like, different audiences that get access to a feature. Because a lot of times in my work, we deploy features to a small subset of customers, maybe just one. Maybe not any customers. Maybe we just turn it on for ourselves and just, like, look at it in production and see if it makes sense. So we can turn it on, we can go and look at customer accounts, make sure, we don't really look at customer accounts, we look at our internal account, make sure that works, make sure it works on some of our demo, like, internal testing organizations or internal testing accounts. And then once we're happy with that, we can turn it on for everyone that works at the company. We can turn it on for everyone who has an admin or a staff account, right? And then we can, maybe we're talking to customers directly, and, like, they really want this feature and they want to get access to it as early as possible, before it's even finished. So we can turn it on for them, and we can talk to them and be like, it may be broken and janky, it might not work, it may be complete garbage, but we can at least talk to you about it and find out the ways that it is garbage and find out the ways that it is not garbage, and take the things that are garbage and make them into not garbage. But we need to be able to do that without disrupting the rest of customers. So there's this idea of segments, like multiple, your user base can be split into different groups or different audiences that you want to deploy a feature for. So then we need a way to, like, define those audiences, right? So we have to have some sort of conditions. So we need to be able to, like, build segments of customers and separate them by attribute. And so I've kind of, like, leaned into this idea of, like, maybe we deploy for one customer, and that's an organization or a group of customers. Maybe we do it by email address, right? And then even within that group, we don't want to do it to everybody right away. Maybe we only want to do it to 1%, or maybe only to 10%, or maybe only to 50% of people, right? So we have a way to, like, incrementally expose and deploy a feature without having to do code deploys. We just have to deploy one file, just this one file. So that's our configuration. And so the way I've kind of structured this is, like, a segment contains many conditions, and those many conditions all have to pass for the feature to be granted. But any one segment can pass. So if you don't pass for the internal test, maybe you pass in, like, the VIP group, or maybe there's another group that we define. It can change. So then we have to connect that to our application. So we go into config app, and we load, not that one. And we have to load our config file. So part of our application startup is loading another config file. You could write this config file in a different format, but the PHP code one is quite nice, because then you can validate it and check it as syntax. So we load our config, and then we need a way to kind of query this feature and be able to interact with it. So let's look at how it works inside of a controller. So I'm going to use the framework's ability to do dependency injection. So we're just going to give our controller endpoint we're just going to say we want a feature manager given to us. And then what the framework is going to do is just complain that it doesn't exist. So then we've got to tell the framework how to make a feature manager. So we do that in our application controller or application class. Inside of our services hook, we can define a new service that is shared. And the reason we want to use a shared service is that once we get it the first time, each time we get the feature manager again from the DI system or the DI container. We want to have the same feature manager returned each time. So a shared instance in a container, you get the same object every single time. If you don't use add shared, each time you fetch an object from the container, you get a different object, which may be good, may not be good. Depends on the scenario. I wanted the same one, so I made a shared object. So then I have this feature manager, and I provide some inputs to it for how it's going to do stuff. The first argument is going to be a closure, which is going to convert my application data into something that can be used with the feature system, and then we're going to provide all the feature flags that we have in the application as well. Okay, so now we can look at feature manager. And kind of similar to Jorge, I like to put pieces of the application that are related but not directly, maybe they're not the core piece of the application into plugins. I find plugins are a really nice and underused way to organize code. If I had been doing a better job, I would have written tests, and then we could have the tests with the feature manager code. But we'll just look through this code piece by piece. So we're going to take a context manager, or context builder, and some configuration. And I'm using some newer syntax from, I think, PHP 8.2, maybe 8.3, I'm not sure. Maybe it's 8.1, but you can have so many PHP versions, I don't remember what comes out in each one anymore. But if you're on a recent version of PHP 8, you can do this. And what this does is allow you to skip having to define the property, define the parameter, and then assign the parameter to the property. So there's this shortcut called promoted constructor parameters, I think is what it's called. And this lets you just define the constructor property, the object property and the constructor and the assignment all at once. So it's kind of nice. You can also obviously have a normal constructor if you want to modify some of the other parameters that don't just get stuck into properties. You can do that still as well. And you can mix and match promoted constructor parameters with non-promoted constructor parameters. Because a lot of times in PHP, you're just taking a bunch of parameters through the constructor and sticking them into properties. So they just made that a lot easier. Okay. And then our main interface for this feature system is checking if someone has a feature. So features have names, and then they have a collection of data that we're going to use to make decisions. And it could be anything. Most of the time, it's just going to be an organization and a user for us. So the first thing we have to do is get the feature and kind of build it from config data. So we're going to build a feature from config, and then we're going to return it. And then how do we build a feature? I don't know why this isn't letting me do jumps. So when we build it, it's just going to be built of many segments. And segments have many conditions. So here we are here. If a segment has conditions, we build all of those. And when we match a segment, we're going to loop through all the conditions. And if any of the conditions don't match, feature's not given. If the feature does match and the rollout is off, you don't get the feature either. And then we want to do something that you'll eventually want in a feature flag system, which is, as you're doing a rollout, you start at 5% and then go to 10%, right? But the criteria, if you just do a simple dice roll, the people who had it at 5% could lose it because you're just rolling dice, right? Random numbers, if it's less than 5, you get the feature. But you don't want to do dice rolls. You want to do consistent dice rolls. You want rigged dice is what you basically want. And we want rigged dice. We want them rigged so that if you were a winner at 5, you're also a winner at 10, and you're a winner at 50, and you're a winner at 60, right? So once you become a winner, you stay a winner. And the way we do that is just with really simple hashing, really simple dumb hashing. So we take the context data and we make a number. We hash it. We take all of the contents. We put it into JSON, and we stick it into a hash like MD5, and then we turn the results of the MD5 into a number. And then we use that number as an ID, and then we just modulus it, because modulus will tell you whether you're above, if there's a leftover, or if you exactly match. So we just use some really dumb hashing and some really dumb math, and now we have rigged dice. So if you're a winner at 5%, you stay a winner because your number will, the leftover of the modulus operation will continue to be true. So yeah, that's how we do rigged dice rolls for our feature flag system. Okay, and then for conditions, if we look at that config file we had, we have the ability to like define a property, define some sort of operation, and what the value is. And so I built a couple operations. There's like an equal. You can see if something is equal to something else. This could be, you know, an email address is equal to another email address, or a name is equal to another name, or I don't know. The person has opted in to access features before they're finished, like an early adopter flag or something along those lines. And then in addition to that, there's like an in, which is like this attribute from the current user is in this allowed list of values that I want to give access to. And then obviously there's the negations of those as well. So not equal and not in. All right. So then we go kind of back up the stack. So we were at condition, and we go and look at segment. And so a segment will run all the conditions, and conditions will basically just run through their property, their logic, doing returns as they go. If we can't figure out what the operator is, we just return false. And then we go back up to the feature itself. So if we wanted to see if a feature matches the current context, we go through the segments, do all the matching. If it works, we return true. Otherwise, no. And then we're back up to feature manager. And that's it. Now we're back at the end. So now we're back here. If we go back up to our organization controller, we can do a feature flag check. So we kind of, if we're going to adopt feature flags, we have to go through the application and instrument the pieces that have new code or new, logic we're not sure if it's going to work, or maybe it'll break production, or it'll break whatever environment you're deploying to, or maybe you just want to have features enabled per customer, right? A lot of times in enterprise orgs are like you need to do specific customizations for specific customers, right? You could do that with feature flagging instead of having to build specific scenarios, like if the customer is this, give them this feature. You can think about it more abstractly and design the feature as a unit of logic or a unit of capabilities, and then put that behind a feature flag, and then incrementally grant those to customers based on what they've paid for, what they're not paying for. So you can kind of tie this into entitlements and subscription kind of management ideas as well. So then in our controller logic, we can check features. We could also build a view helper for this and be able to do feature checks inside of our templates. Both of those are options. I've just built it as a simple kind of controller layer thing. And then we kind of push a template variable down. And then our organization view, we can just write really simple kind of PHP logic based on our stuff. So if we go back to our browser, and we're looking at the organization. So we don't have the feature right now because remember, we were in our template. It says if you're a VIP, you're VIP. You get some good stuff. And so without having to change any of the application logic, we can go back into our features configuration. And we can change this to match the slug of our current org. Mafalda hand. Scary sounding. So we go down here, and Acme already has access to the feature, so we want to give it to Mafalda hand as well, right? And currently at 5%, so we'll see if we win the dice roll. We did not win the dice roll. Let's see if we win it at 50. We win it at 50. So now we can go back to our code, and there's maybe a bunch of different customers in here, or maybe you're just targeting all of your user base. You just want to do an incremental rollout. Then we can change this to like 70%, right? And we can go back and we still are getting the feature. And if we go back down to like 30, feature was bad. We want to turn the rollout off. Feature was not good. It's causing lots of errors. It's putting too much load on the database. It's, I don't know, hurting some other system that we work with. It's maxed at the CPU. I don't know. We can turn the feature off. And now all of the logic that was inside of that feature flag check isn't running anymore. And we're back to being stable. So all we needed to be able to do was be able to deploy this one config file versus deploy the whole application. Maybe your deployment process is fast enough that deploying a config file is the same as deploying the whole code. But in my experience, that is not always the case. And deploying config can often be a lot faster than deploying the whole thing. It's really dry in here. I'm dying. All right. So that's kind of the feature flagging idea. If it seems useful to folks, let me know. I can crack it together and turn it into a plugin. Maybe it would be useful for other applications. It's a pretty simple system. Do it, yeah. I built something very similar at Sentry, so I thought it would be an interesting thing to look at. Pardon? It is in Python, yeah. Okay, the next thing I wanted to talk about is is JavaScript. So Jorge did some interesting stuff today with JavaScript, and I really like it. I really like the renaissance of server-side rendered HTML. I feel like we've for many application scenarios, taking our application state, turning it into JSON, pushing it across the wire, putting it into a front-end framework like Vue or React to turn it back into HTML on the client side is really wasteful and a lot of work, and requires you to have like complicated JavaScript libraries and like more complex knowledge about how to like manage client-side state. And there's been in the last couple of years, there's been kind of a revival of like, what if we just rendered HTML on the server? And the JavaScript community has been working at this for about a decade. They've been trying to figure out how to get React server components to work, and they still don't work. And so they've spent about 10 years, millions of dollars and thousands of engineering hours to figure out how to render HTML on the server. And we've been doing that for, 30 years in PHP land. We've just been rendering HTML on the server. And it works really well, and it's really fast, and it's really easy. And so Jorge's demo today showed like loading pieces of HTML off the internet, from the network, and putting it into the DOM. What if we didn't have to write any JavaScript? Wouldn't that be nice? And so there's a library that I really like. There's a couple of them. I've picked one. It's probably the most memey of them, but it actually is like not a terrible design in my opinion. And it's called HTMX. And so I wanted to go through that and kind of talk about like where I see front end going for like simple applications. Like if you need multiplayer, collaborative document editing, maybe this is not a good paradigm. But if you just need to like render content and incrementally load modal windows, or incrementally load content, or like delete rows in a table, or load new rows into a table, or build drop-down menus with like multiple steps in them, I think this pattern can work really well. Okay. And so we'll start off in the layout. Editor, yeah. We should get an editor. That's a good one. Let's look at our layout. I can't type. Actually, should we break? How much time do we have?
You're halfway.
Halfway? Let's take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll talk more about HTMX and server rendered HTML. Okay. All right. So we were talking about HTMX and server-side rendering HTML, and how we can. There's always there's kind of a trade. There's a false trade-off that gets kind of painted in the JavaScript responsive applications thing. It was like, if you want a lot of interactivity, you have to use client-side rendering. And I don't think that's entirely true. I think you can have an interactive, fast-feeling application with server-side rendered HTML. And so I wanted to show how you can go about doing that. Okay, so the first part is including HTMX. I'm using the unpackaged CDN. I would not recommend using third-party CDNs for production applications. There was a recent sad thing that happened. There used to be a third-party CDN called Polyfill. The owners of Polyfill sold it to a private equity company, and that private equity company was like, we could put malware in this. This would be awesome. And they were able to put malware on hundreds of thousands of websites that were relying on a third-party CDN. So don't use third-party CDNs in production is kind of my, that's all I gotta say about that. But for demos, super good. If we didn't want to use a third party, the way we would go about this is just downloading this script file, putting it in our application, and checking it in with the rest of our application source code. This table is totally wobbly. Okay, the next thing we have to do to get HTMX to work well with Cake is connect the CSRF token, much like how Jorge did it in his kind of talk, was just adding it into the request. And the way HTMX kind of thinks about applications is through a series of extensions. And so the idea with HTMX, and there's other libraries as well, but I'll talk about HTMX because it's specific, and that's what I built a workshop around. The idea with it is that the web is like HTML is based around the idea of hypermedia controls. So you have like links and forms, right? Links let you fetch more content, and forms let you send state back to the server to make changes. And one of the benefits, but forms are kind of clunky, right? Forms are okay, but they're kind of ugly. They're hard to style. They don't always encapsulate everything that you would want to make a change. It's hard to turn everything into a form. You can't nest forms. You can't have forms inside of each other. So what if we could give those abilities of being able to submit data to the server or fetch data from the server to other elements other than buttons and other than links and forms? What if we could make any element be able to do requests to the server? And what if we didn't have to write JavaScript to do all of that? What if we could just do it through some declarative HTML? That's kind of the idea and thinking behind HTMX, or at least the part that I remember and can convey in a quasi-intelligent way. So our CSRF, we have to embed it into the HTML so that we can read it and put it into JavaScript code. And so HTMX thinks of things as extensions, which are like custom HTML, or like packages of custom behavior that we attach to the DOM. And so an extension lets you listen to when it's connected or listen to when HTMX is going to send a request. And when we do that, we can append a header, which is just reading out the CSRF token. So this is how we can add in the CSRF token to all the requests we're going to make so that our forms continue to submit and we continue to not have CSRF vulnerabilities. And then how do we connect that CSRF extension into our HTML? We're just going to use some attributes. So kind of the idea with HTMX is it uses HTML attributes to declare behavior and functionality. So here we're going to connect in the header to do our CSRF token, and any element that's inside of an extension benefits from that extension. Is kind of the way that HTMX kind of models this. Okay. And then inside of this, the kind of the first and most simple solution that we can use HTMX for is incrementally loading the page. So, in many applications, there's some content or UI or Chrome that doesn't change on each page request. And there's the stuff in the middle that does change on every request. And it'd be, much like Ajax in the early 2000s, what if we could only load that center part of that page and just replace that? And that's kind of what we're going to start off with. Okay, and so I've split the layout into two halves, which I find is a useful pattern when working with HTMX. So we have the part of the page that isn't going to change. That's our default layout. So that's going to load once when the page loads. It's going to have all of our script tags, any third-party, JavaScript that you have that you should probably work towards not having, because then you can not have those cookie banners. If you don't have third-party tracking scripts or third-party scripts loaded that use cookies or inspect requests, then you don't need a cookie banner. Cookie banners are annoying, but there are ways to not have them. We just have to work with our friends in marketing departments and say, you can't have those things, because then you have to have a cookie banner. And they're like, but I like marketing. I like ad tech. Nobody does. Okay, but inside of that frame that doesn't change is the frame that does change. So this could include your application sidebar. As you click through links, you want to update the active state in your sidebar, or unfold sub navigation, or update the user's little icon as they change their profile. All of that is stuff that changes as the application updates. And then within that, we have the part where that actually changes the most. And that's where our links are going to come from that are going to load new content, right? And so I've got some external links up in here, and then I put this HX boost on the body of the main part of the application. And what HX boost does inside of HTMX is it creates boost for all of the links that are inside of that. And a boosted link, what it will do is it'll include some extra headers, and then the server can read those headers and then reply accordingly. And if we want to look at how we interact with those headers on the server, we're going to do this. So before we render, if the request contains a HX boosted header, which is something that HTMX is going to set for us, we can switch the layout to the boost layout, which is going to render the main part of our application and our view content, right? And our flash headers, and all of that's going to work out of the box, all with server-side rendering, and we're just going to fetch that centerpiece. Okay, and now we can look at this in the browser. Just gonna make sure I looked at everything. Yeah, we looked at talked about all the important parts. Okay. And so now we've got like a server-side application, but everything is just a little bit faster. It might be hard to see that it's faster, but we can look at the network panel, and we can see the difference in what content is being loaded. So we're going to go to all. So we load the page. There's all the JavaScript gets loaded. There's our HTML. And then when we want to go and look at the view, we haven't done anything to this link. It's just a regular link. No HTMX got attached to that. But if we go into our network, what we should see is a request here, and in our headers, we can see HX boosted. We can see the current URL that was being sent, where this request is coming from. Some applications you want to load different things based on what URL is the sending URL, and that it was a request from HTMX. And then if we look at the response, and we look at the raw version of the HTML, it's just the guts of the application. So we're just getting that gut of HTML. And if we're going back to our template, we put HX boost on the layout, and it's just going to replace the whole body, because the default behavior of boost is it's going to replace the whole body of the sorry, it's going to replace the contents of the boosted element. And so we're just going to keep replacing that content, and it'll eventually update the inside, right? And so we're just going to keep replacing that body class with our boost. And we didn't have to script all of that or write any scripting for that. We just put some HTML properties, and then it all kind of works. And the same is true for forms. If we go into a form, we can look at the network here. We can just type in CakeFest, assign these great team names that Faker made for us, and we'll see that we've sent a request here, and it was a boosted request, and then our response again only contains the body, So we're not refetching JavaScript on every page. We're not refetching CSS on every page. We're just fetching that snippet of HTML, and then HTMX is managing, appending that state into the DOM. So it's kind of similar to a JSON API, right? Like we would normally have to fetch the JSON, put it into, I'm going to use React as an example. It may be many things, but you'd have to put all of that JSON into React. React would have to run, figure out, oh, the DOM has changed. I should run a million JavaScript functions to figure out what DOM has changed. We can do that on the server as well. And for many simple applications or admin portals or anything like that, like simple content management systems, you can get the interactivity and the quick workflow without having to take on all that JavaScript pain. Not pain, but like it's more complicated. Like it's just a lot more to it. Okay, so that's like really simple stuff. We've just replacing the body content, but what if we wanted to build like a more complex UI interaction? Like what if we wanted to build like a modal window, right? Like we're going to delete something, we need to make some changes, we want to show a confirm. If we were in normal server rendered HTML, how would we do a confirm button? We'd have like a JavaScript confirm, which is that like clunky, ugly looking thing. But what if we wanted it to be something a little bit, more integrated with the application? Like we'd want to show like a modal window. So now we need JavaScript again because we got to load a stupid modal window. And we got to put content inside that, so there's more JavaScript. Oh God, we're going to have to write a lot of JavaScript for this. But what if we could fetch the modal window from the server and then put it into the DOM and then be able to do that and not have to write any JavaScript? And then, a lot of delete operations, there's like a confirm or cancel. What if we could make that a form, right? That's 2 buttons. 2 buttons is a form. We could make, we could just submit a form, right? If we can think about things like changes to state and we can make it into a series of forms or a series of things that work kind of like forms, because again, you can't nest forms, but you could nest different HTMX actions and changes. So let's look at building, how we would go about building a delete with a confirm workflow and then like an inline table edit, because those are 2 things that you might reach for client-side rendering to build. Again, I'm not saying that HTMX, I don't want to kind of position it as like HTMX is the only solution. There are many scenarios where you'd want to use HTMX for doing some of the routine kind of pages and like basic CRUD applications, and then you would want to use client-side rendering for charting or for more data-intensive visualizations. I think there's a hybrid approach that that can get to the sweet spot of like, these pages are very interactive and require multiplayer or require WebSockets, and these pages don't. And so we can have a simpler stack on these pages or these views and have more complex stuff there. And then the whole application doesn't have to become a complex JSON data API just because we need it in a couple places. At least that's my theory.
Do you have a page or if you want to have a page?
Pardon?
Do you have a page or with this JavaScript?
With the JavaScript? Yeah. I haven't written any JavaScript.
Okay, can you click on the view?
Click on the view. Like you want to view source?
Action view?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we've just requested another block of HTML, which is basically our view in that boost layout.
But if we need, for example, highlight a menu, in which menu you are now,
Mm-hmm.
then you should move menu outside of main template.
Yeah, let's look at like doing a menu highlight. Okay, so we have, which menu do we want to highlight on the sidebar maybe? So we're in like team, what is this? Projects view. That's not a buffer that's open.
This is a problem.
So our sidebar is right here, being rendered on the server. Right.
If anyone has questions.
Classic. So here's our side nav. So if we wanted to put, a highlighting on here, we could do like span, style. You shouldn't use style, but we're going to use it today because we're doing a demo and we're just hacking stuff up. Maybe I'm using Tailwind, who knows? This kind of looks like Tailwind, right? I have no strong opinions on Tailwind. I'm just filling the time as I talk and type. Why isn't it red? We put the red on list projects. Huh. What? What is going on? Have I forgotten how to do CSS? Oh, I know why. It's because it's an inline block. It's an inline element. We have to do display inline block. There we go, beautiful. So now if we're on edit project and we go back to list projects and we go to view, like our navigation sidebar can change. So the sidebar will be rendered on the server, but it has to be part of that response that comes back inside that boost layout, right? Because we told the app controller that when we get a request from HTMX, we want to just load the boost layout, right? So we told our application that when HTMX sends a boosted request, we only want to render a smaller layout, which is just the interior of our application. If we have stuff in the top bar that has to change as the application updates state, then you would put that inside your boost layout that gets modified or rendered when HTMX requests are made. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. If not, we can spend more time on it. Okay. Go here. All right. You guys are not looking at the browser. And I think it was in Teams. I think I built it for Teams. And then there's a table row element now. You've seen the browser. Okay. Okay, so this is the Teams list view. So there's, I put an element for a table row. I'd planned on the table, but we'll explain the table row. That's the point. Okay, so now we're gonna build a delete button. So if we go back to the browser and we go here, go to Teams. We have a simple table. We have a view, edit, delete. We're going to click on the delete button, and we're going to get a modal window. And if we look at the network, what we requested is we requested some HTML. And there is some script in here, and we're going to fix that in a minute. But there's a little bit of JavaScript here that I had to write. And the reason we are using something new, which is the dialog element. It's a recent addition to the HTML specs. It works in every browser, but it lets you build dialogues. So I can't click on any of this stuff. I can't click on any of this stuff. I can click inside of here. I can click cancel. But yeah, I can go back to the server and get this piece of HTML and stick it in the page. And it looks like I did all of this with client-side rendering, but I didn't. It's all server rendered. You can also style this a little better. I just didn't. And so we're using some new features of HTML, like dialog, to build modal windows, and then we're using a little bit of script. The reason we're using some script is to build this close button, but the close button didn't get rendered because I forgot to write it. Where is it? No, it should be there. Okay, we'll figure that out in a minute. Okay, and if we want to delete sequi, and we'll go OK, and then it will say that it's deleted and not delete it. Okay, so we're going to fix those bugs. But how does that look? How do we load that extra fragment of HTML? And we'll look at that as well. So all we have to do is we're going to build a URL for the confirm flow. And so the way you can think about confirmation dialogues is first we get a confirm dialog, which is a get operation. So we fetch that from the server. We just get a piece of HTML. We stick it in the DOM. and then we'll see what's inside that view in a minute. And how do we get that connected to our HTML? We're going to use a couple more HTMX directives. So the first is like, what URL are you going to fetch? That's hxget, so that's going to do a get request to a specific URL. We're going to pick a target, so you can tell HTMX which element on the page you want to swap. And we told it that we're going to update the body. So you can either do what's called a swap, or you can do an append. And so before the end of the body, we're going to append the content we fetched and stick it in the bottom of the body. And if we go back to our browser, we can see how that works. Okay, so we'll reload the page. I'm gonna click delete. And then down here at the bottom, that's our modal window that got appended to the bottom of the body. Okay, and one of the interesting things is this selector can be any CSS selector. It doesn't have to be body. It could be anything. This requires, I think, some discipline, because you can easily create a rat's nest of selectors. If anything can select anything, you can put yourself in a bad place. So the tool gives you a lot of power, and with that power comes some responsibility that you have to kind of enforce on yourself.
But if the target is non-unique?
If the target is not unique, I don't know what happens. Do we want to find out? Let's find out.
Let's do it.
Let's do some chaos. You guys have seen the browser or the text. So let's just change this to div. I have no idea what's going to happen. This is probably going to go very poorly. That's neat looking. Oh, it just put it in the first one. That's great. So it looks like it'll find the first one and update the first element that matches, as opposed to every element that matches, which would have been a more hilarious result. But it didn't do that. As for your swaps, you can append to the bottom of the element. You can swap the inside of the element, or you can swap the inside and the containing element, like if you want to replace an element full sale from the server. So those are kind of our swap options. Okay, so there's delete confirm. If we go to our routes, where does delete confirm go? One of the other things I really like about named routes is it solves the problem of where does this go? What is the URL for this thing? Because now we have a distinct name that we can search across the application to find out what is referring to the delete confirm flow. So that's a nice benefit of named routes. So delete confirm is over here on the right. And it's just an action. We're just going to go and get something from the Teams controller. So if we go and look at that Teams controller, delete, and then there's delete confirm. So we're going to fetch the organization, fetch the team. We're going to make sure that the person is allowed to do a delete operation, because if they aren't allowed to do the delete, we shouldn't show them a modal window either. We can just show them an error page. I didn't build error handling. Maybe it's just an empty response that does nothing. You probably shouldn't be showing them a delete button. Going back to like access control checks, like if you don't show the delete button, then they can't click it. They can't get the modal window. But yeah, so we're just going to set some team and organization data to the template. So then we should have a teams delete confirm. And then inside of here, we're just setting a layout to a modal. We'll look at that next. But we're just making a form, putting out some HTML, and generating some links. So there's a link for cancel, which does modal close. So that's how our cancel button works. And then we have a button to submit the form to do our request. So our modal window is still doing like a get to get some HTML. We're still doing a post to do a delete. Well, actually it turns into a delete request. So we're still doing like basic forms, good server-side rendered HTML, and we're able to build a little bit more complex like client-side rendering workflow. Okay, so now we're going to look at that modal layout. What's in there? Just a dialog element from HTML. And we have to do this. The reason you have to do this is if you append a modal window into the DOM, it doesn't display by default. You have to turn it on. And the way you turn it on is with scripting. You can also use HTML attributes to open the dialog, but then it doesn't come with the screen behind it. It just opens up in an annoying way. If we want to see what that looks like, we can do that really quick too. And I think it is show equals true. I'm going to really test my knowledge of the HTML spec right now. If not, we'll look up the docs for dialog and find out how it works. Okay, so we reload. Yeah, the dialog just didn't show. Didn't even come off the server. I don't see our dialog anywhere. Okay, let's just undo that. I'll just do that. So if we don't show the modal, what will happen is nothing. Did I break it? Styles. Okay. So if we take the show modal off, and it just doesn't show. So I feel like there's some HTML debugging to be done here, because it doesn't really even show up.
There's still a div instead of body in your config of the link. Target parent.
Oh, the target, right. Yeah, that's a good thing to check. No, it's body. Yeah, right here's body. Try one more time. Oh, I think that's what it was. I think you're right. It was the div. Okay, so the dialog's here. And we can go and try and put the show attribute on now. And it doesn't show. Is that because... blah, 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 open. Okay. It's open. So we would want to do true if you wanted to have no scripting. We can do this, but I don't think it will, from what I remember of testing it, is it doesn't display properly. Yeah, perfect. That's exactly what we wanted. It's just stuck on the bottom. So I think we need that show modal to get it to float and to get that screen to display. So unfortunately, you need one line of JavaScript or two. But we'll look at how we can fix this and make it a little bit better in a minute. Okay, so that's our confirm window. Let's just make sure we put that back the way it was. What? No, go away. Oh. Reload. And where did we put that? Oh, we gotta take that open off. Okay, so now we're back to where we were. What if we wanted to like rename this team, right? We could open an inline form. This one's not styled very well, but you know, you get the idea. We can throw some A's in there, and then do all of that. So how does all of that work? Let's take a look at that. So we're doing some inline editing, you know, something that happens a lot in tables. What did we get from the server? We just got a table. We just fetched one table cell with a call span of 4. So we just modified the table directly in place and merged the new state from the server. So that's that new column. So here's the old row. Kind of look at it. We'll look at it incrementally. So we have our row with our 4 columns. When we click edit, we're going to replace that row with a new row that contains a form. Again, going back to nested forms, if you have a form, you can't put forms inside of each other, so you have to use HTMX attributes without a form. And it works fairly similar. The attributes just go in different places and there's no form. But you can still have like a div that contains input elements, and when you submit the div, you can serialize the inputs inside of that div and get them sent to the server. And you don't have to write any JavaScript for that either. But I don't have that demo prepared. Okay, and then when we go back to the server, then we're going to submit, and then we get the table row gets put back in place. And so how that works under the hood is we sent a post request to the server, and then the server replies with a new row, which is the rendered row. And so how we kind of implement that is, if we go back to our tables index, our teams index, inside of here, we're rendering a table row for each table row, right? And then if we go to Teams controller, and we look at edit, there's an inline edit. So if we look at our routes, go to routes, there's going to be an inline edit in here, Teams. And there's our inline edit, and it does both the get and the post. So we can fetch the form and then submit back the form and get the rendered row again. And if we look in templates, team inline edit. Yes. So by default, it's going to render the inline edit because the inline edit template matches the action name. But in the post scenario, we're going to delete the code that we just wrote. We're going to render the inline edit complete template. So we have a different template, whether it's the form successfully submitted or has validation errors or submitted the right way. Right? So we can think of our application as we have these interstitial states as different views that get rendered on the server, and then we fetch them and splice them into the DOM, and then do an action, get a new piece of HTML, splice that into the DOM, which is very similar to the workflow that React has, except you're not fetching JSON, unpacking that JSON into JavaScript objects, pushing them through like thousands of JavaScript functions to be able to figure out like what has changed. On the server, we know what has changed. We modified a row, so here's the new HTML version of that. One of the other things that I find interesting about this kind of approach is you don't have to worry about backwards compatibility with your API, because there is no API. The API is just HTML. And if your CSS, if you're not drastically changing your CSS from deploy to deploy or from release to release, you don't have to worry about maintaining backwards compatibility because it's HTML. You stick it in the DOM and then that's that. So that's kind of an interesting byproduct, I guess. I will say though that if you have an application that has both a web view and a JSON data API, I found it very tedious to have those be the same controllers. And I found it a lot easier to create a separate prefix or a plugin for the data API and have them be completely separate. And if you run into like the next kind of statement is like, oh, but then there's all this duplicated code. Yes, there is duplicated code, and the way we solve that is by using the DI container to build services. So we start containing our application logic into services, and then we reuse it in our HTML controllers, which generate your HTML views and your web views, and then you reuse those same services in your data APIs. And then that gives you the code reuse. You don't have duplicate code all over the place, and then your application becomes a little bit easier to maintain, and you have data APIs separate from the HTML stuff. And so when we want to render that table row again, we just reuse that element. So a lot of like this server rendered HTML flows require you to think about your application a lot more in terms of elements and like view fragments and partials and elements that you can compose together into the template, which is kind of how you would have to think about it if you were doing client-side rendering, right? Like you would probably have a component that rendered each table row like a React component. So you have to start thinking about your application more like components, but those components are just fragments of HTML versus, you know, JavaScript that you have to download and execute. And then as far as this Ajax layout goes, there's nothing in it. It's just like nothing. It's just a way to get the framework to play along. You could also do the approach that Jorge had where you disable auto layout, or I think it was disable auto layout. That's another solution. I find doing it in the templates a little bit more straightforward, but there are many ways to peel that banana. All right, so that's kind of how we can approach doing incremental updates without having to write any JavaScript. And so the only JavaScript I've had to write was for that modal window, right? And now we have an inline script tag, which makes it a little bit more complicated if you're in like a CSP restricted environment, or if you just want to, you know, have reusable JavaScript components and not have script tags floating all over the application. Thankfully, the browsers have gotten a little bit better in the last few years, and we have a little bit more tooling from the browsers that we can use to make this better. Any questions on this so far? No? Yep.
Does it mean that one component needs to know which parts of the application it needs to update when it's releasing itself?
Yeah, so the question is, does a component need to know which parts of the application have to update when it changes? Yes and no. So there's the simple dumb thing is just like fetch, re-render the whole view to be the next state. So you just like download the whole part of the application that changes. The other one is you do like small snippets of HTML, and you have to be a lot more context aware of like what you're changing and where that fits in. And so you end up having to build a lot of like specialized components. I've also found that with building applications through HTMX, you end up building a lot more controller endpoints, like way more. Like every little piece that you would, you know, incremental view change is another controller endpoint that returns a little fragment of HTML. So you end up with a lot more controller endpoints, but they all just do really simple things that return little pieces of HTML versus, you know, you have a general purpose data API that returns this humongous piece of JSON that you then have to like parse through and munge, right? And then it avoids the problem of like REST APIs return too much data. So let's use GraphQL, and then you've created another like JavaScript hellscape, in my opinion, of like using GraphQL. Now you have like this really complicated server system that returns JSON. GraphQL is great for certain scenarios, but like you could just return the HTML you want too, like, and then you don't have to do all of that stuff. So yeah, you either can, like the simple version is just re-render the whole state, or you do pieces that have to be a lot more context aware. There's also a pretty big foot gun in HTMX, which is like anything can update anything. And so you can, if you start using a lot of selectors and like having updates modify selectors up higher up in the tree, or like not a common place where you're going to modify data, you can create this like nasty web of selectors and fragments that update that can be really hard to maintain. Because now if you change if you do it by like class names, now you change a CSS class, you've broken the application. And it's not obvious that you've done that because you changed the CSS class and the incremental loads are now broken. So I think you have to be really careful with how you do that, and either use like team process or have a small enough application where you don't create these kinds of scenarios for yourself. But yeah, there's definitely probably a breaking point at which HTMX becomes very difficult to maintain. I haven't hit it because I've just been building like small personal size applications and like small internal tools with it. But you know, if you were to build something the size of Facebook with HTMX, that would probably be really hard. Yeah. But I think that's kind of like picking the right tool for the right job. Like, yeah, maybe the client-side JavaScript also gets really hard to maintain, and then people come up with like patterns like micro front ends, and like, which is again way a lot of complexity that comes in from that kind of pattern. Okay, so the next thing we wanted to look at was fixing that JavaScript. Fixing that janky JavaScript. No. Okay, so now if we go back to our modal layout, there's no JavaScript, and we've done this. We've made our own HTML elements. So it looks like a React component or a Vue component, but it's not. We're not rendering anything on the client. Well, we're rendering a little bit on the client, but we've encapsulated into a custom HTML tag. And browsers have recently started to expose APIs called web components, which allow you to build your own HTML elements. They can have their own logic, they can have their own formatting, they can render their internals, they can modify their internals, they can also climb up the tree and muck around with stuff outside of them. But it is a browser like sanctioned API for creating pieces of application logic that make it easier for you to manage the complexity of JavaScript and not having to worry about CSP issues. Like inline script tags are kind of clunky, and so we can do all of that together. Okay, so let's go back up to our layout. And we have included our app script as a module. So that's where we extracted that Ajax header. We've extracted that into a JavaScript module, and we can do you can use imports in JavaScript now. If you put a script tag of type module, you have access to ES6 imports. You can do imports from other files. You can do imports from local files, all without a build tool. So I'm doing all this JavaScript imports with no build tool and there's no build. So if you have an HTTP2 compatible web server, it'll pipeline all of these files through a single connection, and it'll be reasonably fast. If you get to like dozens or hundreds of components, you might want to look at a build tool to bundle to like avoid those network requests. I have a really hard time saying that word. But here we are, like we're importing off of the internet, and then we're importing from a local file. And both of those work. We don't have to use Vite, we don't have to use Webpack. We can just use JavaScript. And if we go into our script, JS modal, here we've started to define a modal window. And so we're extending the HTML element, which is how you define a web component. And then web components have to be wired into the DOM. So you have to tell window.customelements about your custom element. So the class name you use for the web component doesn't have to relate to the HTML element name. You could call this class like fuzzy zebras if you wanted to. There are a couple restrictions on custom element names. They have to contain one dash, and it can't be at the beginning. So web components have to have a dash somewhere in the name, and it can't be at the beginning. So you always have to think of like what the component's name is going to be. I chose to put the dash in the middle. So when web components, when the browser is going to render a web component, what it's going to do is it's going to mount those elements, and then it's going to call connected callback. So we're not using any libraries here. We're not using any like polish or veneer or any like improvements to the workflow. So the browser gives you connected callback, which is what happens when the element shows up in the DOM, and there is no callback for when the element is removed from the DOM. Well, there is, but I haven't implemented it. There are also callbacks for when attributes change. So if you want to have some client-side scripting that modifies custom element attributes, you can get callbacks on those when those change, and then you can re-render or you can update the DOM accordingly. But for us in our situation, we just need to query what? That's supposed to be an O. We can just query the page. Well, we're going to query inside of our subtree. So inside of a web component, you have access to all of the standard DOM APIs for modifying the page. So we're going to look at the child elements of this component, and we're going to look for a dialog. If there isn't one, we're going to throw an error, and then we're just going to attach some events. And the nice thing about these events is they automatically get cleaned up when the browser rips the element out of the page. So if we were to submit that form, the modal window element will be removed from the DOM, and the browser will automatically detach all of the event listeners, which is a nice thing. That doesn't happen with other frameworks sometimes. Okay, so now if we go back to our browser, and we load this modal window, we can look at our confirm window. You can see that we got that modal window, and in our sources, debugger, we can go in here, we can put breakpoints, and it all just works the way you would want it to. And so we've made some custom HTML. We're able to debug it. We have no build tools. We have no transpilation, none of that stuff. We're just using browser stuff, just browser features, which is pretty nice. So for simple applications, you can build quite a bit with not very much these days. Web components also include functionality like Shadow DOM. I have not used Shadow DOM because there are many problems with it. So Shadow DOM, if you've not heard of it, I'm just speaking Martian to you, is there's the light DOM, which is the DOM you can see in the the browser inspector, and then there's Shadow DOM, which you can also see in the browser inspector, but isn't as easily accessible to other elements on the page. There's some really sharp edges with Shadow DOM, so I haven't been using it yet. The sharp edges include the styling for Shadow DOM has to be in the Shadow DOM. So this makes it really tedious to integrate with external styles. You can't style Shadow DOM with light DOM styles. So it's an entirely different shadow world. So all the CSS has to be in line with the web component, and that to me was a big deal breaker. And so I was like, nope. Don't want to play with that. I'm just going to do everything in light DOM. And so you can build fairly complex interactions with web components and HTMX if you stay in the light DOM. And kind of linking back to Jorge's tutorial about building components, I've built a couple apps that have custom input elements and custom select boxes. And then I build a form helper widget for those to generate all the light DOM. And then it works just like a regular form input would, but it's a web component, or many web components under the hood. And then you can have them all kind of work together. And of course, you can use a build tool. If you want to use TypeScript for your JavaScript, if you have front-end engineers or full-stack engineers that want to write JavaScript, you can use TypeScript. You can build all your web components with TypeScript. There is also a really great library for building web components. The kind of basic web component APIs are a little bit rough. They're a little bit verbose and wordy, like many DOM APIs are. But this library lit gives you a bunch of JavaScript decorators to make building web components a lot more straightforward, including giving you reactive properties and a render hook that allows you to do client-side templating should you need it. So if you can't get all the way with server-side rendering, you don't have to bring in a heavy JavaScript framework to be able to do some client-side interactions. You can use tools like lit, or you can use web components, just the basic form of web components, and graduate into more complex web components with lit. If you do go down the path of using lit, you will need a build tool to compile the lit components into standard web components. But lit is about 7 kilobytes, and that's still quite a bit of improvement over top of other client-side render frameworks. So yeah. Let's get the editor back up. Yeah, we did all of that. All right. That's kind of the content I had prepared for today. Kind of got to the end. We're a little bit early. I think we're 20 minutes early. But yeah, if there's more questions, I'm happy to answer those now. If you have other things you'd like me to struggle through in a live demo, I'm game. Yeah. If not, we can wrap it up for a little early.
The authentication and authorization plugin is very flexible.
Mm-hmm.
It's a new one, and thus I think you can shoot quite easily in your foot
Mm-hmm.
or get into troubles. And how do you debug these problems?
Yeah, so the question was, how do you debug authentication and authorization plugin problems?
Yes.
Is there like a specific problem you've run into?
Not necessarily. I
Not
guess
necessarily.
Somebody who is new to the whole system.
Ah, that's a hard one. That's challenge.
I think most people will struggle through the basics first setup.
Yeah.
And I think we probably could make it better, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. The initial setup is a pain. I think some of the things we can do on the framework side is we've included this into Bake now. So like if you bake a user's controller and you have the authentication plugin attached, it'll generate the login action for you. But that doesn't address the more complicated part, which is wiring all the services together, adding all of those interfaces. I don't have a good solution for that yet. In theory, what I want to be able to do is have Bake be able to include like code mods. So like you're attaching the authentication plugin to your application. Here's the setup steps or the boilerplate that that plugin wants to add into your application. The thing I've run into is like modifying arbitrary code on people's laptops is hard because you have to like, you can't just like parse it. You can't just like naively squirt code into their existing logic. You have to like parse it, understand it, modify it, put it back. The formatting might change. So building tools that modify code that isn't just like replacing a whole file gets complicated very, very quickly. And so that's one of the reasons we don't have code gen for all of that yet. As for like, could we make it easier to set those plugins up? Completely. Yeah, I think I'm maybe the wrong person to identify the problems. But if you have problems getting these things set up and things you find unclear, maybe there's like better APIs we could have for configuring authentication. I think authorization isn't too onerous. Like this seems pretty manageable. Maybe we should like explore like how these would work with containers. Like maybe an improvement would be just like registering the service with the container versus having this like hook method that gets called by middleware. Maybe that would be a better solution. I'm not sure. But I recognize that they are not straightforward to set up, and I don't have a good solution for them just yet. Yeah. As for debugging, what I do is I start commenting code out until it stops giving errors, and then I add code back in. The other thing that I do a lot when I'm debugging problems in framework code, both my own, both in Cake and in other frameworks, is I just step into their code and just hack it up. Like the framework is it's not this like magical castle. It's just PHP code. Like go in, hack it up, figure out what's broken, go through like if you get a stack trace, look at what each of those frames is doing. Like hack that all up, put debug statements in. And then once you're done and you figured out the root of your problem, just RMRF your vendor directory and reinstall. I do this all the time in my daily work. Like I work on a Python app. I go into Django. I don't care. I'm gonna hack up Django. It does weird stuff. It doesn't give me the answers I want. It doesn't give me any debugging information. The docs don't cover what I care about. I'm in there. I'm just hacking up Django. I don't care. I'll hack up Cake. I did it today. I went in like, I don't remember what that router method is. Like I'll just go in and look at it. And I think you should do the same. Go into the framework. Look around, poke at stuff, look under the rocks that are causing pain. And if you don't know where to start, that can be challenging. Going back to like the new person situation. Yeah. Like for authentication, it starts with the middleware. So let's go look. Yeah. This is literally what I would do. I'd go in here and be like, well, I'm not getting a login. So I don't know, like what problems do people have with authentication?
I guess understanding the moving parts.
Yeah.
And how they work with each other,
Mhm.
and then understanding how to move them together. So it's not this. I can't say this is the problem. So it's really understanding the whole picture, all the moving parts of the whole picture, and
Yeah.
putting it together.
Do you think like like better documentation on how the parts are linked together could help?
That's certainly one thing to approach it, and maybe can we add something to debug kit? That maybe some more introspection to the whole authentication authorization state.
Okay. Yeah, we can explore it. Like the community owns both all of the plugins and the framework. So if we can make it easier to work with, I think it's worth talking about. It is all the challenge. The only challenge we face is with backwards compatibility, right? So if we can find out ways to make it better without breaking compatibility, then we can totally do those things. We just have to work together. Yeah, Michi.
So besides the feature flag plugin,
Yeah.
for tools to create, will there also be like an HTMX plugin?
I thought I saw someone had released like a helper for HTMX. I'm resistant to building a plugin for HTMX just because it's supposed to be simple and I don't think like the main integration was including a script tag and then including 3 lines in the before render for the app controller.
Maybe we can bring back the JS helper into Cake 6.
No. That's a hard pass.
Good old times.
Yeah, so bringing back the JS helper, I don't think that's going to happen. I wrote a big part of the JS helper, and in hindsight, it was a mistake. Mistakes were made. I was trying to do a good thing, and it did not turn into a good thing. Yeah. One of the joys of working on a framework is like all of your mistakes are public and live for many years.
And they will haunt you.
Yeah, yeah. Good times. Love JS helper. Yeah, I don't know how much you would get from an HTMX helper. Like, you'd still have to define all these parameters, which is just HTML attributes, and I don't know how to make that easier. Yeah. Yeah, Remy?
In your demo, you show like a grid. Like, let's say you have like a more complex state where you're hiding and showing column, having like a sort order. Maybe you're like moving columns like left and right. How would you keep that state? Will you keep it in the URL or will you like put it somewhere else?
I think it depends on the application. Like if you want to be able to go back to that view, like you've modified the columns and hide and show rows or hide and show columns. If you need to be able to share that state, you either, how do you do it now? Like if you do it on the client side, you can't share that state. You have to save it as a view or as like a saved query, and then you can share that, right?
Right now we don't keep that state. Only we have like very few state like show this item or like and the rest is stored like locally, like in the local storage. You have the session state, but you cannot share it with someone else.
Yeah. Yeah, so that could be a scenario where you want to do all of that client side. And HTMX is just not a good fit for it. If you wanted it to be, something that you could bookmark and share, then the URL is where you'd have to put all that state. And then if it's URL driven, then you can server render it, right? And you can bookmark that page. You can go back to the exact same view as you were in before.